Alrighty, y'all. So if you want to travel throughout the U.S., your best option is just to hop in your car and drive. It's pretty much it. Beyond that, it's going to be a mission, and it's not ideal. Whereas throughout Europe traveling, you have many more options. At least that's what I've learned and understood. It's what I've always heard. And so traveling throughout Europe is significantly easier if you really think about it. Well, even flying can be cheaper and is usually always cheaper throughout Europe. Even flying. I found that very interesting. We're going to supposedly learn about that and why in this video. This is why European budget carriers are cheaper than their U.S. counterparts. This is by long haul, by simple flying. So be linked in the description down below. So you can watch this whole thing uninterrupted and definitely browse our channel. Flying can be cheap sometimes in the U.S., right? It depends, but usually it's pretty pricey and annoying where you're like, how is it this much for a 3-hour flight?
It's flown low-cost carriers in both Europe and the United States. Have you ever wondered why there's such a huge difference in airfares?
Yes.
Airlines on both sides of the Atlantic use the same aircraft with similar seat densities and an overall similar bare-bones level of service. And yet travelers in the US seem to be shelling out more for each flight. Why is this? First, let's compare the two markets and their routes.
And a schedule you could depend on.
Wow. These old commercials are pretty crazy, right?
The low-cost concept began in the US market in 1971 with Southwest Airlines. However, market deregulation in 1978 really opened up the market and increased competition.
Yeah.
Across the pond, Europe
Now your cheaper airlines usually are Spirit and Frontier kind of leading the charge. Southwest is usually more on par with like regular priced companies, like just kind of average.
Regulated its market later than the US, with liberalization taking place in the early to mid-90s. Ryanair was the first budget airline in Europe and today is the largest airline on the continent by passenger numbers as of 2019, with 152 million passengers.
That's funny. I had never heard of Ryanair in my whole life either until I think it was last year at some point, maybe 6 to 9 months ago around there. I did do a video learning about them and some of their rough landings, right? You get what you pay for. No, overall, I'm sure they're decent, but I believe they're only in Europe. I don't never seen a Ryanair choice for a domestic flight here in the U.S.
And largest low-cost airline, EasyJet, trails behind it with 97 million.
Deregulation
EasyJet,
was
never heard
and
of that
still
either.
is part of an experiment to ultimately reduce ticket prices and remove barriers to entry to new airline companies. In the US, the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 completely liberalized the US market. In Europe, historically, air transport was developed under the control of national authorities. This meant monopolistic national carriers and publicly owned and managed airports, but over the course of about a decade, these barriers began to come down. This eventually led to the formation of the single aviation market, and this opened the door to loads of low-cost airlines, just like Ryanair, to expand across the continent, bringing with them lower fares and more competition for the legacy carriers.
I mean, that's
Tracking
good.
fares
Competition's
isn't easy,
good.
but let's take a look at some factors. As with any airfare, low-cost airline tickets vary greatly between routes, time of booking, and much more. European airlines are certainly more aggressive with extremely low fares during promotional periods. We occasionally see €1
Is that real?
promotion fares, and fares as low as €10 are quite common.
Even €10? €10 for a flight? €1 for a flight? What the hell? That's freaking awesome. I mean, unless like it's so cheap where you're just, you know, they stick a bungee cord around you and you're like hanging off of the wing outside or something. That is hella cheap. Jeez. Oh my God. Because think about it, flights are cool. The fact that you board something and you are somewhere really far away in basically no time. I still, to this day, I've flown a lot, and I still think flying is mind-blowing. Like, it's really convenient. It's really cool. But, man, it usually costs a lot over here.
On average, though, fares in Europe work out substantially lower. Airfare comparison website Skyscanner looked at this in 2018 and found that the average one-way flight with Southwest Airlines cost $149, while the average one-way flight with Ryanair was just $60.
Jeez.
So where does this discrepancy come from?
It's a big difference.
Firstly, there's a more competitive legislative framework in Europe, which is a key driver of low fares. EU legislation allows airlines from any EU country to operate flights in another country, domestic and international. In the US, foreign airlines are not permitted to operate domestic US flights.
Right.
Indeed, the Open Skies Agreement has been a key part of EU aviation regulation for many years. Regulations have developed further in the 2000s with the agreement of a European Common Aviation Area, or ECAA, which liberalises the airspaces of all EU countries, plus a number of non-EU states, including Albania.
This livery is actually pretty cool, Norwegian.com. So it might be something I'll have to look for in the future, as I do like learning about different vehicles and stuff. If you're newer to my channel, usually emergency vehicles, random trucks, cars throughout Europe, right? But planes, that's a whole new world, right? I've always been a casual fan of planes. I'm not very knowledgeable about them like I am with like cars and trucks per se. But I'd like them. And it would be cool to see some different types they use throughout some different Euro airlines, as well as just like the deliveries and, of course, the prices and stuff. It's kind of fun. Kind of fun for me.
Norway,
it's a whole new world.
And more. This means that airlines not only compete domestically with airlines in that country, but also with airlines from other EU states. Whether or not airlines choose to expand into other countries, just the threat is enough to keep fares lower.
Right. So right away, just simply, it's truer competition. And so therefore, the consumer ends up, the consumer can win big because these companies do have to really compete. They can't afford to be the only airline that's trying to make $1 million per flight, right? They got to keep fares low and keep them active, right? Have good times, good destinations. It's kind of good all around.
Another factor for lower fares in Europe is non-airline competition. Unlike the United States, Europe has a well-developed and ever-improving passenger rail system. There are excellent high-speed...
When I'm looking at this rail, it just looks like something from a movie to me. As an American, right? Like, look at how fancy that looks. Let's go back to this shot. First of all, even as a bus, I'm still like getting into the bus game too. We've had a couple videos looking at some Euro buses, and even these look fancy to me. Like, that looks nice, and it looks comfortable, right? Like, holy crap. So that is 1 million times different than the U.S., of course. Not many people are riding buses here. And then, look at that high-speed rail. Oh, that is so cool. And again, is this like what we have in the U.S.? No.
United States, Europe has a well-developed and ever-improving passenger rail system.
Jeez.
There are excellent high-speed connections within and between many countries, as well as night trains on longer journeys. For an even cheaper mode of transport, there is an ever-growing long-distance bus industry.
Right.
With fares just as low or lower than a plane ticket, trains and coaches provide strong competition on many routes, moving people directly between city centres while further pushing down airfares.
Dang, so because of, like I mentioned in the beginning, I didn't know this would actually come into play with this video. How cool. Various options you have in Europe that are very well developed and very good, viable options for consumers. Also affects the airlines and helps keep those prices a little bit lower as well, because you don't want a budget airline that's, 5 times the price of taking a bus. That's not going to work, right? Then no one's going to take the airline. Just going to say, oh, screw it, I'm taking a bus. So, the high-speed rail, the buses, the coaches, the airlines, it's all kind of competition, and it's all, you could argue, equal, at least from my perspective as an American, where planes win 1,000,000% because planes are good here. They're just pricey. You're not going to have options nearly like you would have throughout Europe with the rail and with, really luxurious buses and stuff. It's not as realistic as over in Europe.
Of course,
that's really
rail
good.
And coach
that's
competition
awesome.
exists in the US, but it is much less utilized. Apart from a few key routes, particularly on the East Coast, rail travel remains slow and is often inconvenient.
Honestly, they don't have this near me, so I actually think this looks pretty nice. And this is in the U.S., so I'm not really familiar with this. I've never ridden on this, for example. Again, like he said, the U.S. might have a couple pockets. Remember, humongous country. Might have a couple pockets that have some good rail networks, some good bus travels. I'm not sure, right? So that's cool. But the point is, as a whole, it's not there, right? This is not serving the whole country, even though this looks like a pretty nice setup. If that's only East Coast, well, then that's just it. It's a lot of people don't have access to that. Whereas Europe has more of a well-rounded, setup, I think.
And more expensive.
And it might be pricey.
A third reason for lower
in the
European
US.
airfares is the fact that Europe as a whole has a larger population than the United States, providing for more potential passengers and a better chance at filling aircraft. The population of Europe stands at about 748 million.
Jesus,
more
I didn't
than
know
doubling
that.
the 332 million.
What? Why did I think Europe... I knew Europe was higher. I thought Europe had like 400 million people. I thought it was like barely higher. Jeez, that's double.
In the US.
That's over double.
Along with a high population,
Why did I not know that?
population density in Europe.
Man.
Specifically looking at Western Europe, we have a dense 181 people per square kilometre compared to just 36 people per square kilometre stateside.
Wow, that's a
In
big
general,
difference.
this higher population density should
Jeez.
translate to better opportunities for shorter and more profitable flights.
I did not realize that at all.
Our fourth reason is that European airlines can take advantage of an abundance of smaller airports.
Yeah.
In fact, Europe has many smaller underused airports which are sometimes further, but not too far, away from cities. Next up is the topic of fuel taxes. Indeed, a big cost difference enjoyed by European airlines is untaxed fuel. Airlines in the US pay tax on aviation fuel, which varies from state to state.
Right.
Aviation fuel has long enjoyed a special status over other fuels. Since the 1940s, many countries, including those in Europe, have not levied a tax on it. This originated with the Chicago Convention, which prohibited the taxation of aviation fuel. However, the European Federation for Transport and Environment points out that this only prohibits the taxation of fuel already on board an aircraft when it arrives in another country, not the taxation of fuel loaded onto the aircraft.
Yeah, that
Since
makes
then,
sense.
many countries have introduced aviation fuel taxation, but there still hasn't been the case in Europe.
Wow.
Over the years,
that's
there
big.
have been moves to introduce taxation in Europe from various parties, including environmental groups. New regulation was introduced in 2003, allowing EU countries to tax aviation fuel through bilateral agreements. Change could be in the air for Europe's budget airline sector. Coming out of the catastrophic events of 2020, and as aviation starts to recover, some airlines will be better placed to expand and fill gaps left by bankrupt carriers. This
Right.
consolidation of the industry may ultimately lead to higher airfares in Europe. Of course, consolidation could happen in the United States as well,
Yeah.
leading to higher airfares in this market too.
That's
In the
happened a
short term,
lot.
we may see a lowering of
That's happened a lot in the U.S. over just like the past 20 years. So many airlines have merged or got bought out. And yeah, that ends up usually reflecting in higher ticket prices pretty soon after. So of course, that could happen anywhere. If that happens in Europe, you could expect a little bit of a bump. But that's hard to predict.
airfares as the industry recovers from the pandemic. If the anticipated pent-up demand fails to materialize, airlines may want to drop their fares to lure passengers on board and revive air travel.
Right.
In an interview in November 2020, Ryanair's CEO Michael O'Leary predicted a return to up to 80% of capacity during 2021, boosted in large part by even lower fares. But longer term, any consolidation and lessening of competition would indeed drive up prices. Europe seems more at risk of higher fares, particularly due to upcoming shifts in local subsidies and the taxation of aviation fuel. Both of these have supported airlines' low fares for many years, but may not continue as they have before.
Well, that, I guess time will tell. I want to see when this video is from. Okay, so I didn't know this video is actually from January of 2021, so that's pretty old now, which doesn't, 2021 seems like yesterday to me. I don't know how that's 3 years ago. It's kind of freaky, right? Okay, so I imagine some of this info might have changed. As of course with any video, any stuff that was slightly exaggerated, maybe wrong in this video, I'd love to hear from you guys if you want to correct any of that stuff. But yeah, some of those things could be slightly different just in those 3 years, right? So if there's been any change or, fuel taxes added in, that type of thing, any airline mergers that caused, some price hikes, go ahead and tell us down below. I don't think anything major would happen that would make the prices just way higher all of a sudden, right? It would be gradual. And I think it will take a while, quite frankly, seeing the price difference to catch up to the U.S. and then surpass it. Like I said, there are certain scenarios where you might be able to fly really cheaply in the U.S., but it's rare. It's usually pretty pricey. And I've always thought, well, it's worth it when I fly, because it's really cool to go to the other side of the country in a matter of 3 or 4 hours. But it's costly, and it is annoying on the wallet, right? So the fact that you have so many options in Europe, for the millionth time throughout different videos, I've said is really cool, right? It's awesome. I think you guys already know that. Here in the U.S., I guess we can just be happy that, cars and fuel for cars is pretty cheap. So you can always just hop in your car and take a road trip, which, granted, is very fun, especially out west where there's like beautiful scenery. And it's something I'll always look forward to at various parts of my life. It is a great experience. But it's certainly not fast. And, you are beating up your equipment and stuff. So having cheaper or more accessible, transport options is always better. And one can only hope that the U.S. will try to advance in that stuff. But I think we're way behind. And unfortunately, I don't see it accelerating rapidly like anytime soon. I also wonder if airline prices throughout Europe started creeping up, people would have viable other solutions. So maybe people would just start taking rail way more than they already do. Maybe people would be taking these nice buses throughout different countries more than they already do. I think you'd have options. So I don't think it would be the end of the world or anything. But that was pretty interesting. That was kind of a different topic, and I had fun with that. We did skip around. There are some parts of this video we didn't even cover. So please use the link down there, check them out, and of course watch that whole video. That was really, really fascinating. I before would have never guessed that airline prices were, I'd say, significantly cheaper for the most part in Europe than versus the U.S. So clearly the competition over there is working. That's all I got for this one, guys. My name is Ian. You're watching IWrocker. And until next time, y'all, stay safe up there and there. I'll catch you later.